Hello and welcome to the Drexel Interview. I'm your host, Paula Marantz Cohen, speaking to you from the Academy of Natural Sciences of Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today my guest is Nicholas Kristof, a columnist for the New York Times since 2001, a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner and the author of many books. His most recent publication, and his second written with his wife, Cheryl Wudun, is entitled A Path Appears, Transforming Lives, Creating Opportunity. Nicholas Kristof, welcome to the Drexel Interview.
My pleasure.
You are an unusual columnist, reporter, insofar as you report news, but you're also sort of a social activist. I mean, I don't know if you take issue with that word.
I flinch slightly at that,
but we'll get
only
back
slightly.
Slightly because it's a little strong, but I do think that that's how you're perceived.
I wouldn't argue with that.
And I want to get to that, but first get to the roots of it, perhaps, and talking a little bit about your background and your upbringing. Could you tell us about your parents and your family growing up?
Sure. So I grew up on a farm out in Oregon, in a blue-collar area, and indeed, I think my background in two ways kind of reflects the new book, A Path Appears. One is, we really want to encourage, Cheryl and I really want to encourage people to get engaged in causes, and one of the standard reasons why people don't is because it always feels like a drop in the bucket. And my dad was a East European refugee who ended up in Yugoslavia and then France, and a family in Oregon sponsored his way to come to the US. And, I always think of that as a drop in the bucket that didn't solve the global refugee problem, but for my family, of course, it was completely transformative. And the other is that we write about opportunity and inequality of opportunity in this country, and my home area in Yamhill, Oregon has been devastated kind of since the time that I left high school. The jobs went away. People who didn't have college degrees, and in some cases didn't have a high school degree, were really left behind and kind of shattered. And there was a drift among men toward substance abuse, especially methamphetamine, which then, in conjunction with mass incarceration policies, meant that they were convicted, they had prison records, they became pretty much unemployable. The next step was kind of family breakdown. And so you have this area, that I dearly love, and yet it's plagued by unemployment, by substance abuse, by family breakdown, and then by a lot of young people who are kind of replicating this cycle. And that pushed us to try to figure out what one can do to try to address these issues.
Well, was this an awareness that you had early on? I mean, was this something that propelled you into journalism? No,
when I was in high school, actually, things were still kind of looking up. And you'd had the earlier generation, they'd gone to World War II, then come back with a GI Bill of Rights. They, in some cases, had gotten an education, and they'd found blue-collar jobs at the local steel mill or the local glove factory or in timber operations, and they'd managed to do okay and have kind of a middle-class life, and they were living better lives than their parents had, and they expected their kids would live a better life in turn than they had. And then everything began to kind of fall apart all at once. Timber jobs, the glove factory closed down, the steel mill began laying people off, and nothing really replaced that.
Well, what is it then that made you decide to go into journalism? Was that a lifelong desire? Were you always a writer? Were you always an observer?
The roots of it actually began in the 8th grade when there was an organizational meeting of a school paper at Yamhill Grade School, and a bunch of kids wanted to have a school paper, but nobody really wanted the work of editing it. And so they resolved to start a paper, and they elected me editor in absentia. And thus my journalism career was born. And then I loved it. I loved the beauty of the writing. I loved, the chance to make a difference here or there. And it was just a great way to meet very cute girls in school.
Okay, that often is a propelling aspect. you've traveled widely as a journalist for the Times in LA, Hong Kong, Beijing, Tokyo, and you've been all over the world. And I wonder about that. What about those travels has shaped you and your perspective as a journalist? And are you someone who had a yen for travel, or did it come the other way, where you were placed in these places and then you sort of became more and more interested?
I think I do have a bit of a wanderlust, a bit of an adventurous streak. And I also really came to believe that if you want to report on a place, don't talk to experts in Washington. You actually have to go to that country and get out of the capital and talk to people who aren't just university-educated men in their 50s or 60s. You really have to go out and talk to people more broadly. And so I've done a lot of that. And I think that also, the truth is that when you see some of the world's injustices, I think that it's hard to just put that away and move on to other issues. So one issue that I've written a lot about is sex trafficking. And that came from one article I wrote back in 1996, and I never thought I was going to do more than one article. But you see a 14-year-old girl locked up in a brothel in Cambodia, and it feels just like slavery, except she's going to be dead of AIDS, in her 20s, and it's just really hard to kind of move on and go back to writing about exchange rates.
And that is something that separates you from fellow journalists. I mean, getting back to the social activist aspect, you're taught as a journalist to detach yourself, not as much as a columnist,
right,
but as a journalist. And yet it seems to me that that always must have rankled on you in some ways or worked against the grain. And I wonder about that. Did you early on realize that you had this tension in you as a reporter?
I mean, actually, I'm not sure it did rankle, although I spent most of my career as a foreign correspondent, and there you have more flexibility. And it's, if you're a foreign correspondent and you come across a kid who's been shot, then you don't sit and watch the child die and take notes. You put the kid in your vehicle and take the child to the hospital, and there's just no question about that. And so I think I had more freedom abroad. And then after getting the column, it became clear that the challenge is to how to engage an audience on issues that I care about. And these often seem so remote and so distant that I kind of look for any button I can possibly push, whether it's I win a trip contest where I take a student with me, or whether it's getting celebrities involved, or an online game on Facebook, or indeed sometimes diving into the middle of the story. And so I've done kind of all of the above and trying to shine a little more light on some of these stories.
To get attention drawn to issues that you think are important, you use every tool in your toolbox.
Exactly.
Well, getting back to the sex trafficking issue, because that was a controversial piece, the 2009 piece about the Cambodian sex trafficking, where there was a claim that your source had not been abused, but had been...
Smelly Man,
yes.
I think. Okay,
and
yeah.
I wonder about that, and if that's changed your relationship, the idea being that there you were misled by someone who perhaps was not telling the whole truth in her account.
Yeah.
Has this changed your way of dealing with sources?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we still, so that was a woman who led an anti-trafficking organization. Newsweek this spring raised questions about her backstory. More recently, Marie Claire has raised questions about the Newsweek reporting. I don't know what the truth is. I just don't know. But, at the end of the day, people don't always tell you the truth, and you know that, and you try to, triangulate as much as you can. You can't fully, but you do the best you can. But and that's one reason why it is so important to go out and report in the field.
Well, there is so much abuse and injustice in the world. I mean, you must think of possible column ideas that every day that would be important. How do you make your choices? Is there a sense in which you do a kind of triage and you think about what would be most hard-hitting or would grab people the most?
I think to some degree when I got my column, I thought that that's how you have influence, that you write about some issue and you change people's minds. And in fact, it doesn't really work that way. That if I write about an issue that is already on the agenda, if I write about President Obama or the Middle East or gun control or abortion, then by and large, you don't change minds. People who start out agreeing with you think, oh boy, that's exactly right. People who start out disagreeing with you think, Kristof's just being preposterous again. And where you can have an impact is in spotlighting an issue that people are not paying attention to, and then projecting that issue onto the agenda. And so... Can
you give me an example of that?
Well, sex trafficking is one that I think I brought a lot more attention to, because it's uncomfortable and sort of made people spill their coffee in the morning. The Darfur genocide would be another. Some global health issues like obstetric fistula or maternal mortality. I think those are issues where it felt like it really helped to project it on the agenda. And that's what the books are about, too, very much.
Right, and I want to get to them, but just a few more things about your columns.
Sure.
You had a column not so long ago, When Whites Just Don't Get It, about racism. And I quote from the column, you said, you took aim at smug white delusion about race relations in America. That was the first column. And then you wrote a second column, which I thought was an attempt to try to be fair to everyone concerned. It was sort of a palliating column. I mean, can you talk a little bit about what propelled you to write the first column, and then the response to it, and then writing the second column?
Sure. So I wrote, it seems to me that race divide is a very basic one in this country, and that African Americans actually have a much more they talk about race much more. Whites tends to be a more uncomfortable conversation, and that whites are often kind of oblivious to some of these challenges. So I wrote this column, the first one, When Whites Just Don't Get It, and then indeed got inundated with comments to say, basically the problem is that blacks aren't marrying, aren't doing this, aren't doing that, it's their fault. And so then I wrote the second one, the When Whites Just Don't Get It, Part 2, and then I have in mind a possible third one that I may do at some point too.
Can you give us a little hint of what the third one would be?
It has to do a little bit with the criminal justice system, which I think has been a particular source of injustice, often, rather than justice.
You also wrote a column that was dear to my heart, Why the Humanities Still Matter. Of course, that's been chewed over now for quite a while. What motivated you to write that column?
I think that there has been, increasingly this pressure on students to feel that they're being left out if they don't major in computer science or business or whatever. And I really wanted to say that the content, that while those computer science students are going to come up with great new devices for us, that what gives our life a sense of fulfillment and meaning is often what is emerging from the humanities. And a new Apple phone is great, but it's a platform, and what goes on that platform is what enlightens us and distinguishes us. And so I wanted to push back at some of the scorn directed at the humanities.
And I guess you did address the idea that in this, with the college debt and with the job crunch, it's understandable that people would give the humanities short shrift.
That's true, and indeed I have a son who is thinking about a PhD in philosophy, and so
a practical route.
That's right. He probably will not be supporting me in my old age, but
but you have to put your money where your mouth is.
Absolutely, absolutely. I want him to have a fulfilling life, and I think that if philosophy is what moves him and gives him a sense of larger meaning and fulfillment, then I'm all for that.
Well, I want to talk about your latest book, A Path Appears, Transforming Lives, Creating Opportunity. It seems to me it's a kind of how to be good manual, in a sense, showing...
That's an interesting way of putting it, but that's good. Yeah,
that's right. A set of case studies about people who, in need, and the organizations and individuals that have risen to help them. And you wrote it with your wife. What motivated you to write it?
A couple of things. Our last book written together, Half the Sky, was about empowering women worldwide. And after we wrote that, people kept coming up to us and saying, so what do I do? And we wanted to answer them. And I think there's so many Americans who do want to give back or engage in a cause, but feel overwhelmed by the challenges, don't really know what to do. We kind of wanted to push them in specific directions where there is a real evidence base of what works to make a difference. And the other is that everybody recognizes that we have profound problems of inequality in this country. And the metrics are overwhelming. The top 1% owns more than the bottom 90%, things like this. But the inequality of opportunity is even greater than that inequality of wealth. And I think that there is some evidence about things we can do that will make a difference to provide that opportunity. And especially it's things like early interventions. And so we wanted to plug some of those interventions and those organizations engaging in those change-making behaviors.
Could you give us an example from the book of one particular compelling example?
Sure. Well, there's one right here from Philadelphia that we highlight in the book. There's a young man named Alejandro Agacortigas, who was a Teach for America teacher here in Philadelphia. And he was so excited. He was, really going to be the best teacher ever, and he wanted to have good metrics and measure how much his students were learning. And so in the fall of his first year, he gave his students an achievement test, and he figured, okay, they'll have gained months and months and months. And he found that they were actually behind where they had been the previous spring because of summer slide. These were disadvantaged, kind of marginalized kids. And he was aghast, but he found that this issue of the summer slide is a huge issue for low-income kids. That middle-class kids get dragged around to the library, the summer camp, all kinds of things. And lower socioeconomic status kids don't get any of that. So he started a summer program here in Philadelphia that has been very successful for these kids, and it has turned an average of a 3-month decline in reading levels, reading scores over the summer, to a 3-month gain. So a 6-month differential. And that's not going to solve the problems in the Philadelphia school system. It's not going to solve the problems for these kids. But over time, that can make a real difference.
That's an inspiring example.
Absolutely, and there's so many of these ways, whether it's at home or abroad, where there are things that really do kind of work. We talked about another organization that promotes literacy, and basically doctors hand out books, free books to low-income moms who come in for well baby visits, and they prescribe reading to the child. It only costs $20 to sponsor a child in that program, and there's very careful studies showing it means that there's much more reading in that house, and yet 2/3 of the kids who would benefit from that program don't get it because of cost constraints, and that's just crazy.
Yeah, it's an interesting book in that it is a potpourri of such examples which can trigger ideas in people, I think.
We want people, that's exactly what we want. We want people not just to read it, but then to act on it. And I think for Cheryl and me, the thing that left us most excited was last Friday. I was walking down 42nd Street in Manhattan, and the audio engineer who had done the audiobook version of A Path Appears stopped me on the street, and he told me that after listening to the book being recorded, he decided he wanted to do something, and he thought, well, where is my skill? It's in audio recording. And so he has started a project to record children's stories and distribute them to children, nursery schools, or programs for low-income at-risk kids, so that they can hear some bedtime stories. And we hope that more people will kind of jump like that.
That's a nice example. You wrote this book with your wife, and I wonder about this act of co-writing. What kind of division of labor do you have when you write and work out put together your books?
I think that's a euphemistic way of saying, so how do you write books together and stay married?
Yes, exactly. I mean, the idea of co-writing something is difficult with anyone, but I think it would be particularly difficult with a spouse.
We always figured that we also have 3 kids, and if you can raise 3 kids together and survive, then a book is a piece of cake. A book you can put to bed at night and it stays asleep. A book doesn't play you off each other. And if you screw up, then the stakes are lower if it's a book. So that really hasn't been much of a challenge. We have somewhat different interests. Cheryl is more interested in business, and so we reported on different topics, and then we would write our own chapter or section of a chapter, and the other person would edit it quite intensively. And yeah, I mean, I confess there were occasional bruised feelings as my beautiful prose ended up on the floor, but it makes each of our writing better, and I think we appreciate that.
I think it's a wonderful way to collaborate. I know you are making documentaries now, and I saw your documentary.
Of Half the Sky on PBS?
The treatment of Muslims by Buddhists in Myanmar.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah. I didn't see Half the Sky.
Okay.
What is that one about?
So that was a 4-hour documentary on PBS from our previous book. And so now there'll also be a 4-hour documentary series on PBS beginning in January of the new book of Path Appears.
Oh, I'll look for that, and I'll look for the other one. But this was a shorter documentary.
This was a short documentary. The one from Myanmar was on the New York Times website.
And I thought it was an effective, snapshot, and it was like a column in a sense. And I was wondering about this toolbox that you're developing of, books, columns, reportage, documentaries, short documentaries, long documentaries, and if you see that as how you've developed this kind of matrix of media expression.
It's partly because these are hard issues to engage people in, and if you care about human rights globally or about kids getting left behind here, then I just think you have to kind of try every approach possible. So that's video, it's social media. I do a lot on social media.
You were one of the first at the Times to have a blog, weren't you?
I was the first blogger. And the first to do a video, actually.
Really? And when was that first blog? Do you know?
Beginning of 2003, I think, or possibly end of 2002.
Because I imagine now every New York Times reporter has or has to have a blog.
There are certainly a lot of blogs and a lot of people on social media, and a lot of videos being done. I mean, I think we all recognize that we need to experiment in new ways. Do you have a format that you feel you like the most? Is it still the written word? I love the column. It feels like kind of the main line of work, but on some issues, a video is particularly effective, and the PBS documentary, both of Half the Sky and I think of A Path Appears, I think is going to be a really powerful way to bring people into these issues, partly because we also brought in some celebrities, and George Clooney introduces it.
George Clooney, of course.
And on from there is, so Jennifer Garner plays a role in this, and many others. And I think that it's one more way of trying to get people to face up to some of these really difficult issues.
But it is interesting how the landscape for expression, for reporting, has so broadened, and you can choose where you seem to me to be a master at taking advantage of this, and perhaps at the vanguard of it, whereas others are following suit.
We have to do this. Our business model is eroding. It used to be that the work was done when we wrote an article or a book. Now that's when the work begins, and that's when I'm busy on social media. And that's why I'm here.
Do you think you talk about the model is eroding, when we talked earlier before the filming about newspapers and their future, and I wonder if this isn't a way of thinking about newspapers, not that they'll disappear, but they'll be the launching pad for this array of secondary or other sorts of expression, and that they begin it and then it takes off elsewhere.
I mean, I think that, for example, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, the information that we have, the combination of information and opinions, that there will be a market for those, and people will consume it in all kinds of different platforms, and paper may not last all that long. I think for regional papers, local city papers, it's a lot harder to figure out a model that works at all. And I hope we find one, because they perform an invaluable function monitoring local city government, state government, and issues that if they don't call attention to, we're just going to get ignored.
But that may be transferred into a video format, although you can't do the same things with pictures that you can do with words. You can't probe in the same sort of way.
Right, and more broadly, one of the reasons why people used to read through a newspaper was that their boss was reading the same paper, and they didn't want to be embarrassed at the water cooler. And if your boss is now not reading it, but is reading something else, and then you can read BuzzFeed, and somebody else can hang out on YouTube, and there's less of a sense of kind of common shared vocabulary. And that may also mean, as people have a more sort of promiscuous relationship with news sources, that news that is not the dessert but the vegetables just doesn't get eaten.
And that's been an issue for a while.
It has.
How to consolidate around the important issues.
How to make vegetables taste better.
Well, we're almost out of time. I just wanted to ask you one last question. I mean, you are a journalist, you are a columnist. If you weren't doing that, if that hadn't been the road you had taken, what do you think you would have done?
I can imagine having gone into politics to try to make a difference there. I can imagine I studied law and came very close to being a law professor. I think being an academic would have appealed to me more than being a practicing lawyer. And if talent was not a constraint, then I would have been a runner. I've been a marathon runner. Unfortunately, I was constrained, but I don't have that talent.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you so much for being here today. It's been a really good interview, Nicholas Kristof.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for joining us today at the Drexel Interview.